This is Chapter 4, Section 2, beginning on page 98, the section titled Government, Religion, Culture. American Diary. At 16 years old, Eliza Lucas Pinckney took over the family plantation when her father went to war. In 1741, she recorded, quote, wrote to Mr. Murray to send down a boatload of white oak strips, bacon, and salted beef. Sent up at the same time a barrel of salt, close quote. Eliza's major achievement, however, was finding a better way to make blue dye from the indigo plant. Used in military uniforms, the dye was in high demand. Eliza's success turned indigo into a very profitable crop. From the Journal of Eliza Lucas Pinckney. English colonial rule. Main idea. Although the American colonies developed some self-government, the British still set many laws, especially those concerning trade. History in you. How would you react if you were forced to buy clothes from only one store? Read to learn about the trade restrictions that England placed on its colonies. In her writings and activities, Eliza Lewis Pinckney celebrated a new American spirit. The spirit signaled that Americans were beginning to view themselves differently from the way Great Britain viewed them. Trouble was brewing in England, and in the colonies during the mid-1600s, England's monarchy was restored with Charles II on the throne. Many people, however, were not satisfied with his rule. James II, Charles' successor, the next king, attempted to take back the powers Parliament won during the English Civil War. He also tried to tighten royal control over the colonies. In 1688, Parliament took action. It forced out James and placed his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, on the throne. This change demonstrated the power of the elected representatives over the monarch. This period came to be known as the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary signed an English Bill of Rights in 1689 guaranteeing certain basic rights to all citizens. This document became an important part of the heritage of English law that the American colonists shared. Some 100 years later, it inspired the people who created the American Bill of Rights. England viewed its North American colonies as an economic resource. The colonies provided England with raw materials such as lumber. English manufacturers used these materials to produce finished goods, which they then sold to the colonists. This process followed an economic theory called mercantilism. As you learned earlier, this theory states that as a nation's trade grows, its gold reserves increase. The nation then becomes more powerful. To make money from its trade, England had to export or sell abroad more goods than it imported or bought from foreign markets. To ensure that only England benefited from trade with the colonies, Parliament passed several laws between 1651 and 1673. These navigation acts directed the trade between England and the colonies. Colonial merchants who had goods to send to England could not use foreign ships, even if those ships offered cheaper rates. The Navigation Acts also prevented the colonists from sending certain products, such as sugar or tobacco, outside the area that made up England's empire. The colonists had at first accepted the trade laws because they were guaranteed a place to sell their raw materials. Later, the colonists came to resent British restrictions. Merchants wanted to make their own manufactured goods and sell their products where they could get higher prices. Some colonists ignored these laws and began smuggling or trading illegally with other nations. Controls on trade would later cause even more conflict between the American colonies and England. Reading check. Identifying. What country strictly controlled shipping and trade with the colonies and why? Colonial government. Main idea. As the colonies grew, they developed some self-government. History in you. Does your school have a student council to represent students? Read to learn how colonists were represented in colonial governments. The English colonists brought with them ideas about government and a respect for education that had been developing in England for centuries. By the 1600s, the English people had won political liberties such as trial by jury that were largely unknown elsewhere. At the heart of the English system were two principles of government: limited government and representative government. These two principles greatly influenced the development of the United States. When the colonists reached North America, they believed that government was not all-powerful. This idea was already an accepted part of the English system of government. It first appeared in the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. The Magna Carta was signed by King John on June 15, 1215. The Magna Carta established the principle of limited government. This means that the power of the king or government is limited. This document also provided for protection against unjust punishment. It protected against the loss of life, liberty, and property. As the colonies grew, their town meetings developed into small governments responsible for making local laws. By the 1760s, there were three types of colonies in America: charter colonies, proprietary colonies, and royal colonies. Charter colonies. Connecticut and Rhode Island were charter colonies. Settlers were given a charter or a grant of rights and privileges to establish charter colonies. These colonists elected their own governors and the members of the legislature. Great Britain had the right to approve the governor, but the governor could not veto the acts of their legislation. Proprietary colonies. The proprietary colonies of Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were ruled by proprietors. Proprietors were individuals or groups to whom Britain granted land. They were generally free to rule as they wished. Proprietors appointed the governor and members of the upper house of the legislature. The colonists elected the lower house. Royal colonies. By the 1760s, Georgia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia were royal colonies. Britain directly ruled all royal colonies. In each, the king appointed a governor and council, known as the upper house, and the colonists elected an assembly called the lower house. The governor and the members of the council usually did what the British leaders told them to do. However, this often led to conflict with the colonists in the assembly. Most conflicts occurred when officials tried to enforce tax laws and trade restrictions. Voting rights. Colonial legislatures gave only some people a voice in government. Certainly white men who owned property had the right to vote. Most women, indentured servants, landless poor, and African Americans could not vote. In spite of these limits, the proportion of people involved in government was higher in the colonies, estimated at 80 to 90% than anywhere in Europe. This strong participation in government gave Americans training that was valuable when the colonies became independent. Reading check. Drawing inferences. How did the Magna Carta influence governments in the colonies? An emerging culture. Main idea. An American culture influenced by religion and education began to develop in the colonies. History and you. What items or activities do you consider part of the American culture? Grilled hamburgers, playing baseball? Read to find out how the colonists began forming a culture that was different than European cultures. From the 1720s through the 1740s, a religious revival called the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. In New England and the Middle Colonies, ministers called for a new birth, a return to the strong faith of earlier days. One popular preacher was Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts. People thought his sermons were powerful and convincing. The English preacher George Whitefield started religious revivals beginning in 1739. Whitefield inspired worshipers throughout the colonies. The Great Awakening led to the formation of many new churches. Family roles. People adapted their traditions to the new conditions of life in America. Religion, education, and the arts contributed to a new American culture. The family, however, formed the basic foundation of colonial society. Men were the formal heads of the households and represented the family in the community. Men worked in the fields and built barns, houses, and fences. Sons could work as indentured servants for local farmers. Young men also could be apprentices or assistants to workers who taught them a trade. Women ran their households and cared for children. Many worked in the fields with their husbands. Married women were under their husband's authority and had few rights. Young unmarried women might work for wealthy families as maids or cooks. Widows might work as teachers, nurses, or seamstresses. Widows and women who never married could run businesses and own property, but they could not vote. Education. Most colonists valued education. Parents often taught their children to read and write at home. In New England and Pennsylvania in particular, people set up schools to make sure everyone could read and study the Bible. In 1647, the Massachusetts Puritans passed a public education law. Each community with 50 or more homes was required to have a school. By 1750, New England had a high level of literacy, with about 85% of the men and about half of the women able to read. Many learned from the New England Primer, which combined lessons in good conduct with reading and writing. Widows or unmarried women ran many colonial schools. Quakers and other religious groups in the middle colonies ran others. In towns and cities, craftspeople set up night schools for their apprentices. The colonies' early colleges were founded to train ministers. The first was Harvard College, established in 1636 by the Puritans in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Anglicans founded William and Mary College in Virginia in 1693. The Enlightenment. By the middle of the 1700s, many educated colonists were influenced by the Enlightenment. This movement began in Europe and was based upon the idea that knowledge, reason, and science could improve society. In the colonies, the Enlightenment increased interest in science. People observed nature, staged experiments, and published their findings. The best known American scientist was Benjamin Franklin. Freedom of the press. In 1735, John Peter Zenger of the New York Weekly Journal faced charges of libel. He had printed a critical report about the royal governor of New York. Andrew Hamilton argued that free speech was a basic right of English people. He defended Zenger by asking the jury to base its decision on whether Zenger's article was true, not whether it was offensive. The jury found Zenger not guilty. Today, the case is regarded as an important step in the development of a free press in America. Reading check. Analyzing. In what ways did the Great Awakening influence culture in the colonies? Section 2, review. 1. Vocabulary. Define each of the following: successor, guarantee, export, import, charter colony, proprietary colony, royal colony. 2. Explaining. How did the Navigation Acts affect colonial trade? 3. Illustrating. Discuss how people in the charter colonies participated in government. 4. What was taught from the New England Primer? And we'll move to 7. Answer the essential question: in what ways was an American culture developing during the colonial period? That concludes Chapter 4, Section 2.